Well, hello, how are you today? This is going to be the last part of our Easter devotion, Easter week devotion, Holy Week. 6 hours, one Friday, Max Lucado. His final chapter of this book, chapter 19, The Final Glance. Max, your dad's awake. I've been watching a movie on television, one of those thrillers that makes you or takes you from here to there and transports you to somewhere else in some time. But my mother's statement seemed to come from another world, the real world. I turned toward my father. He was looking at me. His head was all he could turn. Lou Gehrig's disease had leached his movement, taking from him everything but his faith and his eyes. It was his eyes that called me to walk over to his bedside. I had been home for almost 2 weeks on special leave from Brazil due to his worsening condition. He had slept most of the last few days, awakening only when my mother would bathe him or clean the sheets. Next to his bed was a respirator, a metronome of mortality that pushed air into his lungs through a hole in his throat. The bones in his hand protruded like spokes in an umbrella. His fingers, once firm and strong, curled and lifeless. I sat on the edge of his bed and ran my hand over his barreled rib cage. I put my hand on his forehead. It was hot and damp. I stroked his hair. "What is it, Dad?" He wanted to say something. His eyes yearned. His eyes refused to release me. If I looked away for a moment, they followed me and were still looking at me when I turned back. "What is it?" I'd seen that expression before. I was 7 years old, maybe 8, standing on the edge of a diving board for the first time, wondering if I would survive the plunge. The board dipped under my 70 pounds. I looked behind me at the kids who were pestering me to hurry up and jump. I wondered what they would do if I asked them to move over so I could get down. Tar and feather me, I suppose. So caught between ridicule and a jump to certain death, I did the only thing I knew to do. I shivered. Then I heard him. "It's all right, son. Come on in." I looked down. My father had dived in. He was treading water, awaiting my jump. Even as I write, I could see his expression, tanned face, wet hair, broad smile, and bright eyes. His eyes were assuring and earnest. Had he not said a word, they would have conveyed the message. I think sometimes you know people like that. They could speak to you and not say a thing. Had he not said a word, they would have conveyed the message. But he did speak. "Jump. It's all right." So I jumped. 23 years later, the tan was gone, the hair thin and the face drawn. But the eyes hadn't changed. They were bold, and their message hadn't changed. I knew what he was saying. Somehow he knew I was afraid. Somehow he perceived that I was shivering as I looked into the deep. And somehow he, the dying, had the strength to comfort me, the living. I placed my cheek in the hollow of his. My tears dripped on his hot face. I said softly what his throat wanted to, but couldn't. "It's all right," I whispered. "It's going to be all right." When I raised my head, his eyes were closed. I would never see them open again. He left me with a final look, one last statement of the eyes, one farewell message from the captain before the boat would turn out to sea, one concluding assurance from a father to a son. It's all right. This story means a lot to me for several reasons, but the one that I'm thinking of right now that I want to share with you is, if you notice, most people who paint or draw a picture of Jesus, a key part of that picture always seems to be the eyes. Isn't that interesting? And Max is wondering if that wasn't true of a centurion who was there when Jesus was crucified. Here's what he writes. Perhaps it was a similar look that stirred the soul of the soldier during those 6 hours one Friday. He was uneasy. He had been there for a very long time. It wasn't the deaths that troubled him. The centurion was no stranger to finality. Over the years, he'd grown callous to the screams of the crucified. He'd mastered the art of numbing his heart. But this crucifixion plagued him. The day began, as 100 others, dreadfully. It was bad enough to be in Judah, but it was hell to spend a hot afternoon on a rocky hill supervising the death of pickpockets and rabble-rousers. Half the crowd taunted, half cried. The soldiers griped, the priests bossed. It was a thankless job in a very strange land. He was ready for the day to be over before it began. He was curious at the attention given to this flat-footed peasant. He smiled as he read the sign that would go on that cross, the King of the Jews. The condemned looked like anything but a king. His face was lumpy and bruised, his back arched slightly, and his eyes faced downward. Some harmless hick, mused the centurion. What could he have done? Then Jesus raised his head. He wasn't angry. He wasn't uneasy. His eyes were strangely calm as they stared from behind the bloody mask. He looked at those who knew him, moving deliberately from face to face, as if he had a word for each. For just a moment, he looked at the centurion. The Roman looked into the most pure eyes he'd ever seen. He didn't know what the look meant, but the look made him swallow and his stomach feel empty. As he watched the soldier grab the Nazarene and yank him to the ground, something told him this was not going to be a normal day. As the hours wore on, the centurion found himself looking more and more at the one in the center cross. He didn't know what to do with this Nazarene silence. He didn't know what to do with his kindness. But most of all, he was perplexed by the darkness. He didn't know what to do with a black sky in the middle of the afternoon. No one could explain it. No one even tried. 1 minute the sun, the next minute darkness. 1 minute the heat, the next a chilly breeze. Even the priests were silent. For a long while the centurion sat on a rock, stared at the 3 silhouetted figures. Their heads were limp, occasionally rolling from side to side. The jeering, silent, eerily silent. Those who had wept now waited. Suddenly the center head ceased to bob. It yanked itself erect. Its eyes opened, and a flash of white, a roar, sliced the silence. It is finished. It wasn't a yell. It wasn't a scream. It was a roar, a lion's roar. From what world that roar came, the centurion didn't know, but he knew it wasn't this one. The centurion stood up from the rock and took a few paces toward the Nazarene. As he got closer, he could tell that Jesus was staring into the sky. There was something in his eyes that the soldier had to see. But after only a few steps, he fell. He stood and fell again. The ground was shaking, gently at first and now violently. He tried once more to walk and was able to take a few steps and then fall at the foot of the cross. He looked up into the face of this one near death. The king looked down at the crusty old centurion. Jesus' hands were fastened. They couldn't reach out. His feet were nailed to timber. They couldn't walk toward him. His head was heavy with pain. He could scarcely move it. But his eyes, they were afire. They were unquenchable. They were the eyes of God. Perhaps that is what made the centurion say what he said. He saw the eyes of God. He saw the same eyes that had seen a near-naked adulteress in Jerusalem, a friendless divorcee in Samaria, and a 4-day dead Lazarus in a cemetery. The same eyes that didn't close upon seeing man's futility, didn't turn away from man's failure, and didn't wince upon witnessing man's death. It's all right, God's eyes said. I've seen the storms, and it's all right. The centurion's convictions began to flow together like rivers. This was no carpenter, he spoke under his breath. This was no peasant. This was no normal man. He stood and looked around at the rocks that had fallen and the sky that had blackened. He turned and stared at the soldiers as they stared at Jesus with frozen faces. He turned and watched as the eyes of Jesus lifted and looked toward home. He listened as the parched lips parted and the swollen tongue spoke. For the last time, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Had the centurion not said it, the soldiers would have. Had the centurion not said it, the rocks would have, as would have the angels, the stars. But he did say it. It fell to a nameless foreigner to state what they all knew. Surely this man was the Son of God. What does Good Friday mean to you? Think about your celebration. Observance probably is a better word this year. What are you thinking about today as we anticipate the resurrection and Easter Sunday? World events have changed everything, haven't they? You had plans. You had plans you probably can't keep. But the fact of the matter is, nothing can stop our celebration of Easter. It can change it, but it can't stop it. What are you going to do with that? I want to close with these words from the United Methodist Book of Worship. I know that Pastor Brian was looking forward to doing a Easter Vigil today, and in his honor, I want to read these words from the Easter Vigil. I think it says it all. Rejoice, O earth, in shining splendor, radiant in the brightness of our King. Christ has conquered. Glory fills you. Darkness vanishes. Darkness vanishes forever. Rejoice, O holy church, exult in glory. The risen Savior shines upon you. Let this place resound with joy, echoing the mighty song of all God's people. It is truly right that we should praise you, invisible, almighty, and eternal God, and your Son, Jesus Christ. For Christ has ransomed us with his blood and paid the debt of Adam's sin to deliver your faithful people. This is our Passover feast, when Christ, the true Lamb, is slain. This is the night when first you saved our forebears. You freed the people of Israel from their slavery and led them with dry feet through the sea. This is the night when the pillar of fire destroyed the darkness of sin. This is the night when Christians everywhere, washed clean of sin and freed from all defilement, are restored to grace and grow together in holiness. This is the night when Jesus Christ broke the chains of death and rose triumphant from the grave. Night truly blessed, when heaven is wedded to earth and when we are reconciled to you. It will be different, but may this be a very special Easter celebration. Thank you for joining me in the videos all of this week. Next time we're going to look at the book of Philippians. Happy Easter. Let's celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Amen.